Let's turn our attention to the UK general election. In terms of dates, everyone's still speculating, despite what the Prime Minister said last week. And it was quite unprecedented, Gareth, wasn't it, for a Prime Minister to even comment on an election date in the way that he did?
He was trying to avoid a Gordon Brown 2017 scenario.
2007, you mean?
2007 scenario, yeah. So
10 years ahead of yourself.
Gordon Brown in 2007 was riding high. He was very popular, had done a good tour of the country. Everything was going very well for him. And it looked like he was going to call an election in the autumn. David Cameron, who at that point was still quite green. He wasn't ready at that point, but he came out, gave a barnstorming speech, and Gordon Brown bottled it. He bottled an election. People use the Grand Old Duke of York scenario. He'd led everyone to the top of the hill, and then he had to lead them down again. He wouldn't go through with it. Now, the problem is that Rishi Sunak was suddenly found himself in the position where people were speculating about a May election. So if he then left it and didn't call one, the fear was that people would turn around and say, you've done a Gordon Brown, you've bottled it. I actually think as soon as he said that, it massively increased the likelihood of an earlier general election, strangely enough, because by doing that, he actually has opened up the possibility that he could call a snap election again, because people are no longer speculating on that. I still think it'll be November, mid-November. I don't think he'll go into December as he did last time. I think that having, sort of 8 or 9 hours of daylight on polling day was not particularly good for political campaigners.
Well, they got an 80-seat majority.
Yes, but it was a big risk going at that time. It was a very, very unique election, 2019. People were absolutely fed up to the back teeth of Brexit at that point. I think that my money would be on November, but it wouldn't surprise me if he goes early. And by early, he would have to go for May, because, as I said a moment ago, I don't think he's going to go just after a bad set of local election results.
Joe Tyman, what's your view?
I think that the wording, this working assumption that it would be the second half of the year, is deliberate to offer a way out. I think if an absolutely barnstorming budget is delivered in March and suddenly the British people turn around and say, well, this is fantastic, we're back on the Tory train, then I don't think we can rule out May, but I do think it's highly, highly unlikely. I think the important difference is you get to May and you're 15, 20 points behind in the polls, you have no chance of winning. But at that point, there is a non-zero chance of winning in the autumn. Something might happen. Yeah. Now, of course, it might make things worse, but it's not the same as being essentially certain that you're going to lose in May.
Events often can influence election dates, can't they? And I mean, just before we started this hour, I was saying about this cabinet meeting that's going on at the moment by phone, where they're talking about military intervention in Yemen. Well, I mean, wars are usually quite good for incumbent governments, aren't they? So,
well, they weren't very good for Tony Blair. But they were good. They
weren't bad for Tony Blair. He won a stonking majority after the Iraq War.
Yes, but longer term. I mean, he took the hit in.
They don't care about the longer term. All they're worried about is the short term. And I'm not suggesting that Rishi Sunak would start military action, just think, that will mean I can win an election. But the consequences of that could mean that the Labour lead starts to erode over the next couple of months.
The reason I make the point about Blair, and indeed the point about Thatcher in the 1980s with Falklands, is what they both benefited from in those instances was an improving economic situation as well. And
people forget that.
And that is a very easily forgotten point. And what we don't have in this country is an economy that people perceive to be improving. And for me, the most interesting statistic of the last 6 months has been the fact that when you ask the public to choose between the Conservatives and Labour on the economy, the Conservatives have not been below 29% or above 33% for more than 6 months. You have to go back to June last year for the last time it was outside that very narrow band. It's just completely flat in statistical terms, and no announcements, whether it's the autumn statement or all these other announcements on economic policy that the government has made, has had any impact on that. And that is a real worry if you're a Conservative.
And what about the personalities here? Because I can't remember who told me these statistics, but I did check them up and they are right. That in the year before the 1997 election, Tony Blair had a plus 19% poll rating. Keir Starmer's is minus 22, I think, if I remember that right. And David Cameron was plus 16, I think, in 2009. So, I mean, should that be a concern for Labour?
It all depends on how you measure these things. There's absolute measurement and there's relative measurement. It has been the case, certainly it was the case that Tony Blair was very popular, but at the same time, Labour were on 57% in the polls at one stage under Tony Blair. Needless to say, they didn't win 57% of the vote in 1997. But it's the relative measure that's absolutely important, and the relative measure, not the absolute measure that's important. And crucially, I believe that you should ask about how someone's doing in the job rather than about whether you like or dislike them. And so when you ask, are these leaders doing well or badly in their job, you find that Keir Starmer has been fluctuating around about net zero, ironically. Now, that is not a particularly good figure overall. By historical terms, not bad, but not a great figure overall. But it's an awful lot better than Rishi Sunak on around about minus 20. And so you don't necessarily need to be massively high in terms of your personal ratings. But if you're massively ahead of your opponent, that's a really good thing. And to go back to the point on the economy, it's never been the case that a party has come from behind on leadership ratings and the economy to win the most seats at a general election.
Gareth, if we look at the personalities of the different party leaders, how much are they going to themselves determine the tenor, the tone of this election campaign?
Certainly the last few general elections have been very personality focused. I think that a lot of people have commented that if you go back to even the 90s, you saw many more of the cabinet and shadow cabinet, whereas now it's very, very heavily focused on the individual leader. So it clearly is going to have an effect. I think a big question is going to be how the public get exposed to those personalities. Are we going to have, for example, debates? They will make potentially a very big difference. I suspect with the debates that personally, I actually think Keir Starmer could do quite well from the debates. I think that he will come across quite calm every time he is interviewed. He comes across as someone who is, you could easily argue, quite boring, but he certainly isn't offensive. Rishi Sunak, when we've seen him in debates quite recently against Liz Truss, he didn't come across that well. Certainly in a couple of the earlier ones, I think he got better as time went on. My feeling is that personality does matter, but we've now gone through a period of the Conservatives being so low in the polls for so long that almost nothing they can do makes an improvement. And there does come a point. There came this point in around about 94, 95. There also came this point at the back end of 2007, as we've just been saying, into 2008, where there's just a general mood that actually it is time for a change in government. Yeah. You can almost sense it. You can sense it in the way that the politicians that are being interviewed on the media, you can sense it in the way they carry themselves, the way that businesses and lobbyists are gravitating towards the different political party. You can just sense that there is time for a change. Now, of course, in 2010, it didn't quite happen. The debate, arguably that election debate, which David Cameron agreed to and proposed, was supposed to show him off as the next prime minister. As it turned out, arguably that debate resulted in Nick Clegg's boost, which meant that he didn't get a majority overall. So it's a big risk. But what has Rishi Sunak got to lose at the moment? That it's very difficult. He doesn't have control over what I think is going to be the single biggest issue at the election, which is going to be interest rates, which affects mortgage rates, which affects the cost of living. That's a huge thing for his target electorate, and that he doesn't have control over that. The Bank of England does. And if the Bank of England don't reduce interest rates, there's not very much he can do about it.
Right, I want predictions from you, what the election result is going to be. We've got a couple of questions which we'll come to after the half-past news. I'll put my neck on the line first. And I said in my New Year's predictions that I thought there'd be a Labour majority between 30 and 60. So I'll go for 45. Joe?
You want specific number?
Yeah.
Labour 30. Labour majority of 30.
Gareth?
Labour majority of 80.
18?
80. 80. I think it's going to be pushing towards a landslide.
Wow. Well, we'll bring this up when we on election night and see who was right on that one.